All right, so I am here today to talk with you about how to write survey questions. I'm really excited about this topic. This is a topic near and dear to me as a strategist, and I'm really excited to talk through good survey strategy, what that looks like, some principles that you can use as you write questions, and get into the nitty gritty. So, thank you so much for joining me. And just if you have questions at the end, excited to talk. I'm Emily, so I'm the new to Atten UX strategist. I've been in this kind of role for a little over 13 years now. And I am super passionate about human-centered design, and especially research methods. So I'm really passionate about helping people put humans at the heart of what they do and the heart of their websites, their services, and their products. So that's why I'm here to talk with you today. And I thought that it would be kind of helpful to talk a little bit about what a full service redesign is. And so here at Atten, what we do is we have three phases. We have strategy, we have design, and we have development. And that encompasses our full service redesign. So maybe you have a website and you want to completely overhaul it. What we might do in the strategy phase is we'll sit down, we kind of talk about your goals, what you want to accomplish, what you think that some of the pain points are, where you think people maybe are getting hung up on your website, where it's difficult to use, any competitors that you particularly like, and what they do well. We talk to users, we get feedback, and then it moves kind of on to design. We start designing wireframes, and design takes over, and they'll talk to you about kind of tone of voice, what you want the overall layout, the look and feel to look like. And they take all of our findings and kind of transform that into an entirely new layout. And then it moves into development, and development builds it out. The strategy phase, and obviously I'm a little biased because I'm a strategist, but the strategy phase is really important for evidence. And that's kind of what I wanted us to think about today and think about with surveys is evidence, right? And when we think about evidence, there are varying qualities of evidence. And what we're trying to do in the strategy phase is optimize the quality of the evidence while meeting kind of the constraints of the budget. So as the process devolves in our specific process, when we move from design to development, things get handed off and sometimes either lost in translation or designers or developers kind of have questions about why certain decisions were made in the strategy period. It all comes back to us. And so what we want to do in this phase is really build a solid foundation of the highest quality evidence that we can. This is really kind of our true north. If we think about it in terms of, to use an analogy like a direction, we want to know which way is north, so we know which way is south, east, and west, right? And so strategy, this phase is about building evidence. And so how do we do that? Well, one example I'd like to kind of walk us through is the Tampa airport. So the Tampa airport came to us for a full service redesign, and we had a robust strategy phase where we used kind of a mixed methods approach. That means we did both quantitative and qualitative research, and I'll talk about what that means in just a second. But as you can imagine, most of us have taken flights in our life, and there's a lot that goes on in an airport, right? There's a lot that we need to know. So the first thing that we want to do in this strategy phase to kind of build our evidence is think about who our users are. So this might involve working with stakeholders. It might involve talking with users of the website to kind of find out a little bit more of their profile. In this particular case, we worked with stakeholders and we defined our user base. For Tampa Airport specifically, we decided that there were four main components or four different personas of the user base. You have airport guests, so people flying in and out of the airport, or maybe people picking up and dropping off, transport. There are business partners, so maybe existing and potential concessionaires, existing and potential suppliers, everybody that wants to kind of do a business exchange with the airport. We have the Tampa community. The Tampa community is kind of the local organizations, so like the Chamber of Commerce, economic development groups, job seekers perhaps, and neighbors and individuals kind of surrounding the airport, right? Their input matters. and the Hillsborough County Aviation Association and airport staff. So there's some oversight by the HCAA, and there's airport staff, right? Concession management, parking management, content creators, that kind of thing. The important thing here is all four of these categories are going to use the website very differently. And so we need to think about that when we think about how to design a website. And finally, we need to think about what they need. And so this is just one example in a survey that we ran to kind of figure out, okay, if we're going to make a website, we have a homepage and we have a menu. We can't put everything on the menu, even though we as stakeholders or researchers, we might think it's important. The people who actually use the website might have a different perspective. And so one of the questions from the survey was to rank how important certain elements of the page are. So you can see here, not surprisingly, checking a flight status is really important. Finding information about flights. And interestingly, finding information about parking. And that may or may not be true depending on the airport, how robust the local public transport is, all of that kind of thing, right? But here we learned that was a big deal. And so what we can do then, oops, sorry, is we can do something like this, where if we know that parking is a big deal, users have told us that parking is a big deal, we can put it front and center on the site. And that's exactly what we did. So now users, right when they go to the site, they can look at parking, they can view the rates, they can make reservations, and that's great. So how did we learn this? Well, as I mentioned, we did both qualitative and quantitative research. Qualitative research is the study that is sort of centered around conversational data. So when you need to know the why behind the what, maybe you're curious why people are so interested in parking. We often use qualitative as this sort of exploratory method to get insights. And I know that sometimes it can seem a little bit, maybe not the most rigorous thing that you can do, but when you set qualitative research up in a very systematic way, it gives you a lot of rich insight into why people do what they do, their attitude about your website, and kind of it sort of has some explanatory behavior power around behaviors on your website. It's the why behind the what. So you might be familiar with in-depth focus group or in-depth interviews, focus groups, contextual inquiries. All of these are cornerstones of qualitative research. On the other side of that is quantitative research, and that's largely what we're going to be talking about today. Quantitative research is describing phenomena that is already occurring. It's something that you can tangibly quantify or count. Quantitative helps us understand generalizability. So whereas maybe you did, or maybe we decide to do in a project some interviews, and we find that most people complain that it's really difficult to find information about, with respect to the airport, security wait times. But since maybe we only interviewed 10 people and there's hundreds of thousands of people that use our airport, we don't know how accurate that is to everybody. So that's where we might want to think about quantitative methods. How generalizable are these findings? And quantitative research methods include not just surveys, but analytics, A/B testing, anything where there's sort of a count of something at the end, that's quantitative research. And today, of course, we're going to be focusing on surveys. And I think with surveys, there's a temptation to do them because it feels like you can get a lot of data really quickly. And they're a great method, but they're not appropriate in all cases. So a few questions you can sort of ask yourself if it's the right move to do a survey. One, you want to know how often something occurs. Maybe you want to understand something that you can quantify, such as preference, order of importance, of certain page elements. Or maybe you just want to understand the demographics of your user base in a way that analytics can't give you. Those are all great opportunities to use a survey. And I just kind of want to point out here too, there's a lot of nuance with determining whether or not you should use a survey. So that's not exhaustive, but it's helpful to sort of think about whether or not you're trying to count something, whether you want to know how often something occurs, or on the other hand, whether or not you really want to know kind of why something is occurring. So maybe you want to know why people engage with your site, the journey they take before your site, on and after. Maybe you want to really understand the pain points and why they're pain points, what the goals are of the user. Maybe you just want to understand the role of your website in their everyday life. How are they using it? That is more suited for qualitative inquiry. And so that's when you kind of want to stop and assess if a survey can really give you the kind of answers that you need, or if it's time to move on to something different. But today, you've decided that you want to do a survey. So first, you need a sampling strategy. And a sampling strategy, that could be an entire other webinar, but I want to touch on it because the idea of representation is really important. When you design a survey for a website redesign, it doesn't necessarily have to be as statistically robust as, kind of like major national surveys that we do, but you want to think about who the audience is of your website and specifically who of that audience you want to hear from. Do you want to hear from everybody? In the case of Tampa, something that we thought about are, say, elderly and people who have a disability, right? They're often a little harder to reach. They might not engage with technology as often as their counterparts. And so in that case, we kind of think about oversampling that population or sending out, trying to target specifically that population and get a lot of results so their voice is heard in the analysis. So as important as writing questions is a sampling strategy. So you want to think about how easy or difficult it is to reach the target audience. And then if it's difficult, how you can maybe go a little bit overboard to incorporate their voice into your findings. The other key piece here is demographics. So if your demographics closely match like the demographics, say, of your county, which for Tampa, likely, you want to make sure that it's roughly the composition of your survey respondents roughly match those demographics, right? If you find at the end of your survey that you're oversampled in one area or another and you want to hear from a different demographic, it's worth writing a screening question to try to screen them out. So these are just some ideas that you can toy with to develop a sampling strategy, but really thinking about representation in terms of who you want to hear from is the critical piece, because then when you go to analyze the survey, you've heard from people that you really want to hear from. Okay, so you've got your sample, you've got your sampling strategy, you're ready to go. What do we do now? And I think this is where the fun begins. So you write your survey and you get to write questions. And this is the fun part, but it can often feel a bit daunting. Surveys take some time to structure, they take a lot of time to work through. And so what I want to talk about today are just some principles that you can follow. Look at some examples of not great questions and how you can rewrite them, and give you an idea of best practices. And before we start, I just want to remind everybody this list is by no means exhaustive. Writing a survey is technical and complicated, and this should help you get started. And if you have more questions, of course, you can always reach out to us. So let's talk about the first principle. The first principle of writing questions is a matter of, let's call it barreledness, or testing too many variables in a question. So a double-barreled question is exactly how this is implied. Two barrels or two different variables shoved into one question. So you can see here, it's important to be able to see my flight time and gate information on the website. So what we've done here is we've asked respondents to give one response to two different things. Now, we can definitely assume that these things are of equal importance, but we don't want to make too many assumptions because we're not there with the user or the respondent as they're taking the survey. So double-barreled questions you want to avoid at all costs. So what do you do instead? A good alternative, I think, is to think about what if you're thinking about importance, and as we're thinking about importance for the Tampa airport, what are the things that could possibly be important to somebody? List those out and have the user tell you, or the respondent tell you, what's important to them. And that's what we did here. Another elegant solution that I like to think about is a sort rank. So we didn't have them necessarily do that here. We just had them describe each item on a scale of importance. But you can also have users, you can force them to rank, right? And this is an elegant way to do this kind of inquiry as well, because it forces the user to prioritize each item. A respondent can take this question and say, like, everything is super important. And if you get a lot of those responses, it's hard for you to decide what's important, right? If you have the user or the respondent rank them in order of importance, that becomes easier for you to prioritize them. So if you're not sure that the user or the respondents will give you a lot of helpful information in terms of ranking them, if you want to see the top priorities, it's really helpful to try and do something like a sort or force ranking, and that gives you that kind of information. Principle 2, avoid leading questions. So, leading questions primes the respondent to think in one direction or the other, in either the positive or the negative direction. A common question that I see on surveys is something like this: how easy is it to navigate the Tampa International Airport website? It seems like an innocuous question because you can certainly organize the scale of response to not easy to very easy. The problem with this question is that we've primed them to think about Tampa International Airport website in terms of easiness. And that can unintentionally bias your results in the positive direction. We've sort of nudged them that way. A better alternative might be, and this is a really easy fix, how easy or difficult did you find the Tampa International Airport website to navigate? It's a very subtle fix, but it does eliminate a lot of bias in your responses. And you can see here on the left that we've given them what's called a Likert scale. A Likert scale is when, instead of answering yes or no or very easy, very difficult, we've given them 5 different categories to respond to. So very easy, somewhat easy, neither easy nor difficult, somewhat difficult, and very difficult. Important here to note, there are 5 options. Sometimes we use 7 options. I personally like to stick with 5. I think it makes analysis a bit easier. If you're going to do that, you want 2 responses in the positive, 2 in the negative, and 1 in the neutral. That way, again, we don't overly bias our results one way or the other. Now, I like to caution people when using Likert scales. I think they're great. I use them a lot, but sometimes they can muddy the waters a little bit in analysis, because sometimes it can be difficult if a lot of people write somewhat easy or very easy to really distinguish the difference. So as long as maybe you want most people to say somewhat easy or above, if that's your target, it's fine to use. But if you're not necessarily sure about that breakout, you might want to reconsider other options. Principle 3, avoiding loading. Loading and leading are very similar. And obviously, I'm not going to give you a quiz at the end of this. So it's not necessarily, super important that you're like, oh, was it leading or loading? It's just important to remember that you can bias unintentionally the results of your survey by either pushing the user in a direction or infusing something with emotion, and that is loading. So this example here, the Tampa Airport website was redesigned by the best team in the world. Did you love our new website? So obviously that's true. It was the best. No, I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. But here what we're doing is we've really infused a lot of emotion into this question. So we've primed the user to feel something, and that is going to directly influence how they respond to the question. That's a very egregious example. I don't see that terribly often on, say, something for like a website redesign, but for employee feedback surveys or something like that, often I do, and you want to be really careful. Loading can also be quite subtle, which is why I've included this example. In the past 3 months, how have you enjoyed our new and improved website airport map, or airport map on the website? It might be new and improved for you. You might have worked really hard on it, but priming them to think of it as already new and improved when they might not feel that way is going to unintentionally skew your results. So how do we fix that? There are a lot of different ways that we can address that. One thing I like to do in surveys is give people a context or a frame to work from. So, something you can do in surveys that you might already know is what's called skip logic. So, basically, what you can do is you can think about a threshold that you want people to have. So, in this case, let's say we know that there are frequent travelers out there, and we know they probably use websites pretty often. So, we want to specifically hear from them because they're going to give us a good idea of how we stack up against our competition. So we might ask a couple of questions. How many times have you traveled in the past 6 months? How many different airport websites have you used? About how frequently, that sort of thing. If there are users that meet a threshold, let's say we want them to have like at least looked at 3 other websites in the last 6 months, we can direct them to this set of questions, and we can skip all of the other users over this section into the next section of the survey. And so let's say we want to like really hone in on frequent travelers because we want to see how our redesign or how our website stacks against other competitors. So we can say now, in the past 6 months, how many times have you used airport websites to find information specifically about your upcoming flight? And then they can answer, and of those websites, which did you find easiest to use? So this is just an example of how you can set the stage of how you can have users recall information and see how you stack against your competition. Setting the stage, I think, is such a great way to give users like a frame to work off of, give them a little context. My recommendation, if you're going to do that, is a period of no longer than 6 months, possibly a year. But I like to stick with 6 months because we have a bit of recency bias. And so the longer something has happened, the further time in the past something has happened, the less likely we are to be able to recall the specifics. And so I like to avoid that as much as possible. I like to stick personally with 6 months if you're going to do something like that, because you don't want somebody, that has been on 3 different websites, but they were 10 years ago, and airport travel, as we know, changes quite quickly. So I recommend, if you're going to do that for any kind of website, try to stick with 6 months. If you have to expand it a little bit based on your use case, I think that's fine, but 6 months is kind of my rule of thumb. Principle number 4, avoid ambiguity. So what do you think of our website? What does that mean? What do you mean? What do I think of it? Is it easy to use? Is it pretty? Is it functional? That can leave the user sitting there sort of like, I don't know. I'm not sure. That's a really vague question. Without giving people a frame of reference, the feedback is going to be all over the place. So that's a lot of noisy data that you can't really use. Remember, you're going to give a survey, you're going to analyze the results. If the results have a lot of noise or don't make a lot of sense, then you've spent all that time and all those resources, and it's not that helpful to you. This is a good opportunity. If you find your questions are ambiguous quite often, that might be a sign that you need to do something a little more exploratory. And that might be the time to think about qualitative methods. So I know that this is focused on surveys, but I do really want to reiterate that sometimes a survey is not ideal. And you might really just be super curious about, what, like, just open-ended. What do you think of our website? And you might want to know what people think about first. Maybe they're just like, oh, so easy to find flight times, or, oh, I needed to find parking and there was nothing on the website, right? You might be in an exploratory mindset, and that's okay. If that's the case, we're better suited to do something like qualitative research. And principle number 5, avoiding absolutes. So kind of back to our example on parking. If we ask something on a survey like, do you always park at the airport? Well, I might some of the time, but some of the time I don't. Like some of the time I take an Uber, some of the time I stay at a friend's house and they take me. There's a lot of different ways that you can get to the airport. And if you're trying to figure out the frequency with which people park so that you can understand if you want to make something like parking front and center, a better alternative might be, how often do you use something like the park and ride? And then again, now we have a Likert scale. And we have, as you can see, about half the numbers in the positive, half in the negative, and some neutral. This is going to give you a really good sense of, what of a threshold for you to justify where to put something like a button for the park and ride or for parking information, right? If you want, say, 500 respondents, and of those 500 respondents, maybe you want 80% of them to at least say most of the time or almost or every time I fly, then okay, that's super important. I really need that front and center, right? So you can think about thresholds in your analysis that help you decide which menu items, which things to prioritize on that homepage, and which you can kind of put under child pages. Principle number 6, avoiding confusion. So on a scale of 1 to 10, please rate your experience of the security tab on the Tampa Airport website. And maybe you give them a scale, maybe it's like 1 through 10, but you haven't given them a direction, right? You haven't said 1 is terrible, 10 is fantastic. We might assume that, but we don't want to do that, because if we haven't been explicit, and again, we can ask the person what they were thinking when they responded to that, then the data is very noisy and you can't really trust it. It's not valid, right? So we want to think about, when we write questions for surveys, imagine, like, I'm not in the room with this person. I'm not here to like make sure that they're understanding what I'm asking. I want to be so clear and so precise. So what is the good alternative? What if we said, on a scale of difficult to easy, how would you rate your experience finding information about security wait times on the Tampa International website? So again, what we've done here is we've given them a frame. We've given them a frame of reference. We've said, okay, I think, we on the back end, we've decided most likely security wait times are really important. And we think that it's a problem that users can't find it. So I can ask that very specifically, very directly. I've given them a frame, a context to think about. I've removed any direction. I've removed any bias. I've removed any ambiguity. And I've said, on a scale of difficult to easy, and I've labeled my scale, how would you rate that experience, right? Now, when somebody responds to that, we can be very certain that the response they're giving matches what we want to measure, what we are trying to understand. And then again, when we're in our analysis phase, we're not like, oh no, is that, are we sure that's what they were thinking? Are we sure that's what it means? Have we unintentionally biased ourselves? The more you can trust those results, the more you can trust the wireframes and the ultimately the design and development of your redesign, and the more you will see measurable improvements. And finally, the last principle I want to discuss is testing. So all of these other principles you can use to write questions. You can write a survey. You can be like, oh man, I'm so excited. I think I did everything right. I followed all these rules. You still want to test. And I can't emphasize this enough, is testing is so incredibly important. When you have a survey, find some colleagues, maybe find some friends or somebody, or just a few people, even at random, to take your survey and then walk you through what exactly why they answered the way they did, what they thought about it, what they thought the question was asking, that kind of thing. So you have a survey. If somebody's taking the survey, and just be like, okay, walk me through item by item. What was I asking you in this? What did you respond to? Why did you select this response? Surveys are so delicate. They're very delicate and technical instruments. And we know that because we use surveys in a lot of national data, and we use surveys to make decisions about like national policy and that kind of thing. For a website redesign, we don't necessarily have to be so precise. We don't have to do all of the statistical validation. We generally don't have the time or resources for that. But we do want to make sure that the questions are going to yield good enough evidence that we can make decisions. And that when things move to design and when they move to development, we've really established our true north, right? So plan for a round or two of testing for a neutral party.